Okay, this is a combination. This is like take two or take three. This is a combination of a few different pieces I've been working on. And I compiled them together and edited them and made it shorter. And I think it makes sense. I think it makes sense now. I'm going to start off with two quotes. First from Ella Baker. Until the killing of black men, black mothers' sons, because it becomes as important to the rest of the country as the killing of white mothers' sons, we who believe in freedom cannot rest. Ella Baker. Second quote. We revolt because we can't breathe. Frantz Fanon, Wretched of the Earth. Tuesday, May 26. That was the day I first became aware of the video of Officer Derek Chauvin knee being on the neck of George Floyd. For 8 minutes and 46 seconds, handcuffed, face to the ground, body writhing in pain, I saw Derek Chauvin cut the life from George Floyd as he gasped, "I can't breathe." I was stunned and became consumed by rage. Now, I was already angered by the hunting and murder of Ahmaud Arbery, who was killed while jogging in Georgia. I was already upset by the antics of Amy Cooper, who completely fabricated a story of a black male assault because someone asked her to keep her dog on a leash. But George Floyd, that was something too much. I mean, something broke in me. I was scheduled to teach a class that night on contemplative practices and lead a guided meditation. And I was so angry. I was shaking and wanted to cancel class because I didn't think I was, would be able to be contemplative in that moment. So I called the director to discuss this. And in the midst of our conversation, one thing he said to me that kind of changed my perspective. He said, "Adam, maybe the anger in you is sacred work." And I said, yeah, that's a good starting point. What I realized is that I unconsciously believed that anger inhibit or block access to the mystery that's at the heart of all things. But that question made me see anger as an entry point into mystery. Anger is a mode of connectedness to others, a form of compassion and caring. It could be seen as an inward refusal to accept things as they exist, a sign that transformation is required. One of the gifts of the theological tradition is that despite the grave antagonisms and hostilities between police and protesters, between Black Lives Matter folks and All Lives Matter crowd, between Democrats and Republicans, between citizens who wear masks and citizens who refuse to wear masks, that there's an assertion that there's an inherent relationality that's at the heart of all things, that nothing living is self-contained. We are caught, as King reminds us, in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied to a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. In this historic moment, How do we undo racial scripts of domination? This goes far beyond classic notions of integration and civic notions of tolerance. It really challenges us to think about life togetherness. How can we envision life together? A vision that includes a liberated Black humanity as part of the new creation. Can we live among each other in such a way that opens up our best gifts and co-creates a new reality? This moment requires the community of faith to adopt what Sabrino terms the mysticism of open eyes. That is, to move beyond ordinary consciousness and make visible forms of suffering that were previously less visible. It is to awaken to the reality of suffering and engage in practices of responsibility. Black Lives Matter, which functions as a rallying cry for a number of different organizations, is a very distinctive and novel movement in Black history. Unlike most Black social justice movements, this one is not Christian or church-led. The churches that are involved are not the leaders, but have been late adopters to the movement. Moreover, many Black Lives Matter organizers are very critical of the church and clerical leadership. The failures of the church are far more evident than its successes, and Christianity has been deeply complicit in state-sanctioned violence against Black people. Nonetheless, similar to the way liberation theologians use the Black Power movement, the base community movement in Latin America, the feminist movement, the movements for liberation in developing countries, the question for us is, can the contemporary Black Lives Matter movement be used as a theological resource? Beyond its political demands, what new possibilities for creative transformation are at the heart of this movement? What future does it seek to bring into being? What we're witnessing now is a convergence of intersecting framing narratives. The narrative of the virus referred to as COVID-19 and the virus of white supremacy that's existed in this country since 1619. One is a medical crisis, an infectious disease that causes illness and sometimes to death. The other is an organizing logic that structures the world in our interpretation of it and values life in white bodies over life in Black bodies. As recently as last December, nobody was immune from COVID-19, so everyone theoretically has an equal opportunity of being infected. Yet as we enter July, Blacks are 4 to 5 times as likely to die from COVID-19 as whites. Now the virus of white supremacy, that's even more lethal. It's killed more Blacks through slavery, which was legal, segregation, legal, the new Jim Crow, legal, and also the legalized brutality and killing of Black people at the hands of the police. The virus of white supremacy has also produced a kind of Constantinian Trumpism that has a tight grip over the Christian church. Here I'm referring to people who are militantly pro-life when it comes to abortion, but can't seem to support life when it comes to police killings of unarmed Black people. I'm referring to people who, as a matter of faith, refuse to cover their face because they're covered in the blood of Jesus. These narratives, along with the widespread impact of Black Lives Matter, are not just commentaries on race relations alone, but they're commentaries on the state of our civilization. They signify an all-pervasive sickness which is a part of the signs of our times. Nevertheless, we are in a unique moment where the invitation of history has opened up and acute attention is being paid to oppressive racial practices and relations like rarely before. Perhaps the church should see this as a kairos moment, a special moment where maximum change and opportunity are possible. In this moment, America can be kind of figured as the rich young ruler who comes to Jesus and asks him, "What must I do to be made whole?" And Jesus says, "Sell all." And he went away disappointed. Or perhaps America can be like the Pharisee Nicodemus, who kind of snuck away and was told that the kingdom is not about following or obeying some new law, but that the kingdom and the experience of the kingdom was about being reborn again, transformed. So this is an opportunity to not just make minor tweaks and go down the path of reform, but to embrace a metanoia, a turning around. Theologically conceived, Black Lives Matter has been a priority in Black theology since its inception. Its emphasis in the inherent dignity and the sacred worth of Black people is baked into Black theological conceptions. Its concomitant claim, all Black Lives Matter, is a womanist priority that ensures that the concept of human dignity and sacred worth extends to the humanity of Black women, Black queers, and Black trans people as well. Taken together, they are all affirmations of life against death-dealing forces. With the daily circulation of videotaped racist incidents in the US and around the globe, one thing that this moment clarifies is that the way people have been thinking about race has been wrong. Race has been like this head thing, this kind of cognitive thing. And we have to shift from thinking about race as this kind of form of cognition that we can think good thoughts about race to looking at it as something that's part of the nervous system, the makeup. It's somatized in the body. It's about the way human beings are habituated and their dispositions. Because you can possibly think right thoughts about race in your head, but your nervous system, which is much more primal, can move you in a completely different direction. And this was evidenced with Amy Cooper during the Central Park incident. She's a 41-year-old Harvard grad in New York City. Now, from these credentials, you can assume she's a rational human being who lives in one of the most diverse and pluralistic cities in the world, a Hillary Clinton supporter. And if you asked her, does she participate in white supremacy before this incident? Or would she weaponize her whiteness? She probably would look at you like you were crazy and be insulted by even raising that question, right? I'm fair to everyone, she probably would say. I worked hard to be who I am, right? So theology has to have an impact beyond a new form of cognition. It's got to transform the whole habitus, right? And what I'm trying to get at here is we got to get at the precognitive, the pre-reflexive, the pre-theoretical way race has been taught. It has to impact the structures of feeling, the ways of being that give birth to moral life. Can theology have an impact at that level? That's what the question. And in my conversations with local pastors, right, to kind of ensure that their kind of commitment to this struggle for justice, specifically racial justice, is not just some fad that they're seeing on the news. I think the best shot is to emphasize the prophetic dimension of faith, right? What does it mean to be prophetic in this moment? And I've lifted this from Walter Brueggemann, prophetic criticizing and prophetic energizing. What does it mean to prophetically criticize things we're against, or things that are death-dealing? And what are we energizing people toward? This is similar to liberation theology's idea about denunciation and annunciation. So I have three points I want to make on this. First would be unsettling whiteness, or whiteness as an idol, right? That needs to be prophetically criticized or denounced. Adopting a new way of seeing things, where we can kind of connect the rejected body of Christ to the rejected bodies of our world, and then reimagining life together. First, one of the most significant outgrowths of our current Black Lives Matter protests here and around the world has been the toppling and removal of monuments. From Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, and other Confederate statues, to Christopher Columbus, the kind of toppling and removal of those statues, as well as the banning of the Confederate flag in NASCAR, is removal from the State House in Mississippi. Even globally, in England, the removal of slaveholder statues, and in Belgium, right, King Leopold was toppled. All this kind of reminds me of Walter Benjamin's quote, that there is no document of civilization that is not at the same time a document of barbarism. Some have tried to minimize the movement of these statues by saying that how many people is it feeding to remove a statue, how many people is it educating, but these statues are more than material. They're conceptual. Because in addition to honoring individuals who fought to preserve ways of life that were anchored in slavery, they depict how a society sees and remembers itself. And the removal of so many statues in such a short period of time means that our society is wrestling with a dangerous memory. Dangerous memory here refers to memories of human suffering and freedom that interrupt the logic of the way things are. They reveal new and dangerous insights for the present. These unofficial memories open possibilities that reality could have been otherwise. They are dangerous to those in positions of power because they are seeds of resistance and change. So the protests have invoked this new sense of dangerous memories of racial suffering, which are not just part of Western civilization, they are constitutive of it. And that's the tough thing about it, right? Without the type of enslavement of Africans and the genocide of Native Americans and indigenous people throughout the West, this civilization is unimaginable. Right? So how do you, part of the challenge of this moment is how do you restore the Western heritage in such a way that leads to the flourishing of the emerging plurality throughout our society and doesn't stifle it? That's a daunting task because whiteness has been a categorical measure of the moral and human worth, right? It's functioned as a form of idolatry. That's why people get so apoplectic when they see the removal of all these statues. Even monuments of treason. They say it's sinful, it's blasphemous, because whiteness is functioning religiously. So part of what it means to be prophetic at this moment is naming and marking this. Whiteness must be named as a false idol, one of the powers and principalities that blocks us from the deepening life of God within and around us. Whiteness here is not a reference to one's color, right? Not the color of one's skin. It's a way of imagining the true, the good, and the beautiful, configured around white bodies. Whiteness is a way of imagining oneself as the central facilitating reality of the world, the reality that makes sense of the world, that interprets, organizes, and narrates the world. Right? So many liberal and progressive clergy cheer the removal and toppling of Confederate monuments, but my challenge to them is, how can you cheer the removal of monuments, Confederate monuments, but still maintain a white Jesus in your pulpit, right? And still have this white religious iconography throughout your Sunday school literature. The prophetic critique is not just outward to those folks, but internal to your congregation, to your communal life. As a matter of fact, I would argue that the white Jesus has been more detrimental and killed more people than Confederate monuments ever have. Right? So this is the first thing that this moment marks, is kind of unsettling whiteness. Secondly, new way of seeing. Right? In my conversation with local clergy, I've been struck by the fact that few, or probably none of them I've talked to really, has been able to see Black Lives Matter as a theological resource. They've seen them, even if they politically align with the goals, they haven't seen it as a theological resource. And my question is, how can you have a rejected, beaten, and crucified body at the center of your faith and not connected to the real bodies who are rejected, beaten, and crucified every day? Jesus was a member of a despised minority, feared because of who he is. He wasn't regarded as a full citizen and killed because of a routine law and order practice. The crucifixion was state-sanctioned violence, a judicial murder. Now, if that story lies at the center of your salvation story, how can you miss what's happening to Black bodies today? James Cone, in The Cross and the Lynching Tree, kind of paraphrasing Gutierrez, says, we can't think of the death of Jesus without speaking about the real death of people. For in the death of the poor of the world is found the suffering and death of God. Christianity has been so complicit with human oppression, it's hard to disarticulate and disentangle it, right? So in The Cross and the Lynching Tree, Cone argues that the cross has been culturally captive. It has been detached from the real suffering of people and transformed into an ornament, right? Into a form of accessory that you wear with your outfit, right? When this happens, it robs the cross of its theological substance. It becomes a form of cheap grace. So part of Cone's plan in his work is to argue that when you fetishize the suffering of 2,000 years ago, you miss the real sufferings of today. In this present crisis, too many churches pretend it's Easter Sunday in a Good Friday world. The cross is central because it signifies a clash between good and evil, life and death, and love and hate. It's the instrument of cruelty and unjust death that are indelible figures as part of the Christian story of redemption. The cross is not just a one-time event. Many of its victims existed before Jesus and many after. So the work of Christ is not just a once and for all thing, but an ongoing event to be engaged in every moment. James Cone wrestled deeply with the crucifixion of Jesus and the lynching of African Americans. These symbols are separated by 2,000 years and are often not seen as related by preachers or theologians. Unless the cross and the lynching tree are seen together, according to Coe, there could be no genuine understanding of Christian identity in America and no genuine healing of the racial divide in churches, academy, and society. White theologians have written thousands of books about about Jesus' cross without making the analogy between the crucifixion of Jesus and the lynching of Black people. Now, Cone used lynching uses it both literally and metaphorically, for he claims one can be lynched without a rope or a tree, which kind of reminds me of the book, Richard Wright's book, Black Boy, right? He recounts the time when he's growing up in a situation of white racial terror, and he's so shaped by the type of violence that he sees other Black people undergoing. He says something very profound. He says, "The hostility of whites had become so deeply implanted in my mind and feelings that even though I was never abused by whites, I was conditioned as though I had been the victim of 1,000 lynchings." Let me say that again. Even though he'd never been personally abused by whites, the conditioning of growing up around that made him feel like he had been the victim of 1,000 lynchings. That's cultural trauma. And that's what Black Americans feel when they see videos of George Floyd on repeat being choked out to death. Videos of police brutality beating and torturing and lynching Black bodies, right? Even though that may have never personally happened to us, we feel like we've been the victim of this thousands of times. So part of the prophetic response is to connect the crucified body of Christ to the crucified events of today, right? The cross has been over-spiritualized. People forget its absolute horror. So looking at Derek Chauvin's knee on the neck of George Floyd, face down to the concrete, slowly losing breath, whole body wreathing in havoc, eyes rolling to the back of his head while he's asphyxiated, crying out for his dead mother. For Christians, this should be reminiscent of Jesus' arrest, the flogging of Jesus, the torture, the nails in his hands and limbs, the piercing of his sides, eyes rolled up in his socket as he cries out for his Father. Right? If you can't see the both of it, you're missing the boat. So the challenge for us is, can we learn something new about God in this moment? Both were public spectacles, shameful events, instruments of punishment reserved for the most despised people in society. Coe makes the point that the crucifixion is a first century lynching event. What it teaches us is that God chose the foolish things of this world to shame the wise, and God chose the weak things of this world to shame the strong. And God chose the lowly and despised things of this world, the things that are not, to nullify the things that are. God's affirmation of life occurs in experience of suffering, injustice, and death, because God was present and active not only in the life of Jesus, but also in his suffering and death. So to liberate the cross from its cultural captivity, it must be identified with the lynching tree, according to Coe. Pairing these two symbols together reveals a God who is in loving solidarity with the crucified and empowering them to resist the dehumanizing logics that led to their crucifixion. All right, so we have unsettling whiteness. We have, as far as prophetic criticizing, unsettling whiteness, seeing reality from below through connecting the rejected body of Jesus to the rejected bodies of today. The third aspect I want to talk about is prophetic energizing, right? Is how can we reimagine life together? How do we envision the new creation? From a theological perspective, we need to move from Black Lives Matter, which is really just a minimal claim, to Black lives flourishing. The affirmation of Black life is an end in itself, but it should be seen as a generative end, not an isolated or closed end. The principal threat to Black life has been white supremacy. However, it's not its exclusive threat. Part of our current crisis is not just the affirmation of Black existence, but to really affirm the very conditions that make existence possible. This is the form of awareness that happens when we have an infectious disease that disproportionately impacts Black people all around the globe. We're not just concerned about white supremacy here, but the extinction of species itself. And the moral category we generally use to really talk about this is beloved community. But most conceptions of beloved community are so anthropologically conceived, it may not be able to reach the depths of what I'm trying to get at here about our relationship with the earth and creation. So I'd like to lift up the category of the community of life, which is something deep in our African culture and heritage, right? Life is a normative category in the African moral universe. It is inherently relational and can be expressed through a variety of images such as bondedness, interconnectedness, interdependence, communitarianism. What we're faced here is not two separate crises, one social, political, racial, and one environmental, but we're faced with one complex crisis that have multiple dimensions. The community of life is a framework for community where the fullness of life is the organizing logic of all creation, of all relations, the very foundation of community living. Its symbols represent structures of wholeness that invoke the past, regulate the present, and challenge people to live into a meaningful future. Envisioning reality as a community of life tells us who we are and how we should act. Life is conceived as interrelated, and there's an inner demand for whole-making, a feel for completion in and of things. Community is the goal of life, and life seeks to realize and actualize itself. So centering the community of life means that all things cohere in each other. We are bound up and entangled in the lives of each other. Part of the phrases that you might have heard before that really kind of evoke this larger community are, I am because we are, right? A statement about relationality and interdependence. Or the Zulu kind of conception of Ubuntu, which is a relational conception of humanity. We are bound up to each other, right? That we are persons in the company of others. We can't understand ourselves without reference to other persons. And nor can we understand ourselves without reference to nature. Right? People gain a new understanding of themselves when they see life within a total framework. Now, we currently don't have a religious story or a national or cultural story that meets the demands of the community of life. The dominant stories, whether it be Christianity or our narrative of America, are tribal stories, not relational and interdependent. In this moment, we must invite our religious and cultural stories to become more, to situate themselves in the larger community of life. Therefore, the prophetic act is not to switch from one tradition to another, but the call for the reinvention of framing stories themselves. So when we move the community of life from possibility to actuality, then the calls for defund the police and abolish prisons move from radical political demands to moral vision, right? Because in the community of life, there are no police. There's no need for police. And in the community of life, there are no prisons because justice is restorative. Envisioning our life together as a community of life is the best way for the church to enter into the struggle and join with protesters to co-create the new world we want and deserve to live in.